Shields up, Ironbreakers. Rurikhan here coming at you with another video. Welcome back to Monster Hunter World Iceborne, and today we're going to be talking about elemental damage. Now, I'm not really going to be going in depth into damage calculation formulas or anything like that. I'm going to be taking a bit of a simpler approach to the elemental damage problem that I feel Monster Hunter World has, and it's had it pretty much since the beginning. So I'm the kind of guy that likes the idea of optimizing different builds for different monsters. So I pretty much since the beginning, when I didn't really knew all that much about Monster Hunter World before I was aware of all of the inner workings of the game, and I was just like a wee lad trying to play with different gun lances. I actually crafted one gun lance of each element, and I would usually try to match up the element against the monster that I was fighting, because that was fun to me. I was like, hey, you know what? This is fun. I'll do this element to fight this monster, then this other element to fight this monster. This is before I knew about, hit zones and, actual damage values and all of that stuff, because pretty much once I became aware of that, I was like, dude, Gunlance is all about shelling. Like, all of this elemental damage stuff doesn't really matter all that much in the grand scheme of things, at least until Call to Wrath came around. And I gotta say that I feel like Capcom kind of dropped the ball when it comes to elemental damage in Monster Hunter World, and I can't really speak to previous Monster Hunter games because I never got as in-depth in them as I got in Monster Hunter World, so I never really needed to worry too much about whether or not elemental damage was the efficient way of doing things or not. It's just like, hey, this weapon's cool. I'm gonna craft this weapon. I'm gonna use this weapon to beat a monster's face in. I mean, back when I initially played Monster Hunter, I didn't even knew really how skills worked. This was a long time ago, because in previous Monster Hunter games, you have to stack up skills up to like 10 or something for them to actually count. Naturally, since then, I've learned a lot about that stuff because, I played GU and I played 4U, and all of that stuff is something that I went on to learn, but still not in great detail, which is why I can't really criticize, the elemental damage design of previous games. But I can criticize the elemental damage design of Monster Hunter World, and I feel that precisely the reason that a lot of people are upset with Alatreon is because elemental damage has been really poorly implemented into this game. And before we go any further into the video, I want to make sure that people understand that this is still my favorite game of all times, and me criticizing this game does not mean, oh, look, Rurikhan doesn't like this game anymore, because that's what people like to say a lot of times. Like, just because a game's really good, like, you can't criticize it or certain aspects of it. A lot of people feel that way. They're like, what do you mean this game's amazing? Shut the hell up. It's like, no, dude, there's always room for discussion regardless of what game we're talking about. At least, in my opinion, that's the way I look at things. If you are so closed-minded that you can't accept the differing opinion, then, hey, that's up to you. I could, however, be wrong in some of the things that I will say, and I will count on you guys to correct me. Like, I'm not claiming to be the master of reason. This is just my interpretation of things as someone that doesn't look too deep into the numbers themselves. But essentially what I'm getting at is that elemental damage was not really that great in this game. Like, there's weapons where you will want to use elemental damage, stuff like dual blades, bow, I think certain insect glaives, I'm not exactly sure because I don't play that much insect glaive, sword and shield, those types of weapons will benefit greatly from elemental damage, because the way it works is that these are weapons that have smaller motion values. And for those of you who don't know what a motion value is think of it like this. If your attack animation takes a long time, most likely it has a higher motion value, which means it has a bigger multiplier for its raw damage. And elemental damage is not affected by motion value, which basically means something like dual blades, which, small motion values because they attack really fast and they do a lot of hits. Elemental damage is going to be really good on those because it doesn't scale off of motion value. It's just damage that gets added on top of the other damage you already have. On the other hand, if you're talking about a great sword or a hammer, these are weapons that are slow, so all of their moves have higher motion values, which means they benefit much more from raw damage than from elemental damage because they get more scaling. And then you have all of the in-between weapons, that they benefit a little bit from A and a little bit from B. So there's a lot of ground to cover there in terms of deciding, hey, should I use elemental damage on this weapon? Should I go for raw damage? And, and this not only depends on your weapon, but it also depends on the monster, because a lot of the times you'll have monsters that will tell like, oh, this monster is like 3 stars weak to ice. But then you go see the hit zones on the monster, which is something that the game doesn't actually tell you. This is something that you go to like third-party websites for, and those hit zones will show you that like, well, yeah, he's weak to ice when the moon is rising and there's a werewolf howling at the moon at the same time. Basically, you need to fulfill a certain amount of conditions for the elemental damage to actually pay off, which essentially meant that for a large majority of monsters, and I'm talking like a really large majority of monsters, you're just better off going with raw damage. Okay, the only weapons where you would really want to go for elemental would be, like I said, the dual blades, the bows, and maybe a couple of other faster weapons that I can't even remember right now, right? And that's pretty much where we've been throughout the entirety of this game's life cycle. The first time that there was ever a clear advantage to using element, in my opinion, was Call to Wrath. Like, that's when you could really see, oh no, if I use element here, my numbers get really bigger. I get much bigger numbers, particularly when you're trying to get the golden cloak off of her and you would use thunder damage. It was insane. You could get like insane numbers to break off those chunks off of Call to Wrath. And that was the first time that we've actually seen a decent amount of elemental damage. Interestingly enough, with that monster, Call to Wrath, we also saw some of the best elemental damage weapons start to drop. These were weapons that would bring stuff like critical element built in, which would increase the amount of elemental damage. And not just that, they would just have ridiculously more elemental damage than the base weapons of the game. Like, I don't remember what the exact numbers were, but to give you guys a bit of a comparison, let's say some of the best elemental weapons in Monster Hunter World, let's say they had like 200 elemental damage, then the Call to Wrath weapons would have twice as much as that. They would have like 400. They would have like some ridiculous number in an order of magnitude that wasn't even reasonable. And this is when you first begin to realize, oh, it kind of seems like you guys didn't balance elemental damage all that well if you need all of this additional elemental damage on top of the weapon and the critical element to actually get people to use these weapons. It feels like something was not done right. So basically, in its essence, the entirety of the player base has been mostly using raw damage weapons, and whenever Capcom tells them, hey, you should try out some elemental damage, people are like, nah, man, look at my numbers go, brrr. Look at these big-ass numbers that I'm putting out with my raw damage set. Look at this blast go boom with this 300 damage proc every now and then. This is amazing. Why the hell would I use the elemental damage, which brings smaller numbers? I remember myself, I always would try to do elemental damage weapons. Like, if you guys go back and watch some of the builds I did, I was trying to do like elemental damage charge blade, which, you know, wasn't even that great. And I remember using elemental damage charge blades, for instance, on Valhazak, which had like these weird conditions. Like, I think you had to burn the skin off of his back with fire damage, and then the dragon damage would actually kick in, and you could actually also use dragon damage. There's like all of these weird elemental conditions to actually get elemental to do damage. And I remember at one point I'm like, dude, I made this really cool charge blade, dragon charge blade. I'm gonna go kill Valhazak with it. And I hit Valhazak and it's like, dude, what is this, like 10 damage files or something like that? I was like, dude, what's going on? I want the big damage, the big SADs, dude. I can go get my impact files right now, deal 10 times as much damage as this. What's going on, right? Of course, that's also because of my lack of understanding of elemental hit zones and how all of that stuff worked. But ultimately, it would always end up in disappointment, essentially, whenever you would try elemental damage. With the exception, like I said, of the faster weapons, those would usually be pretty good. So the community pretty much started just using raw damage. That's it. We just all defaulted to raw damage for most of the weapons, and that was that. And eventually Alatreon came out, and Alatreon forced people to use elemental damage, and people were naturally like, but I don't even know how this elemental damage stuff, how am I supposed to do this? What kind of builds am I gonna do? Because they never had to do it. They never had to do elemental builds, okay? People would just like focus on their raw damage builds, and then when they had to do elemental, they didn't have the augments, they didn't have the weapons. They just wanted their raw damage builds to work, and I can understand, because the game never really told you, hey, you should do this. And as a matter of fact, I would pose an even more important question in the middle of this, which is, why is it that Alatreon, that requires all of these elemental damage weapons still essentially takes way more damage from raw. Like way more damage from raw, not even remotely reasonable. Like if there's any monster that should take more damage from elemental damage, it would be Alatreon. Like I even did a comparison run. Like I already knew that he takes more damage from raw, but I did a bit of a comparison so that we could have just some quick numbers to look at. And like I did a raw damage gun lance build, and this was very just like slapdash together. It wasn't even a properly optimized build. I could squeeze a lot more damage out of it. But I was like, dude, I'll just grab the set that I have that I use on my elemental gun lance, and I'll just remove the necklace, because the necklace of that set is, will be the elemental damage necklace. And I'll just put an agitator necklace instead. And I was dealing way more damage. Okay, just like way more damage in terms of per poke damage, which by the way, poke damage on the gun lance, because it has a low motion value, technically speaking, elemental damage would have an advantage over raw damage. The only thing I did, like I said, is I removed the elemental damage, so the frost attack that I had in the build, and I replaced it with agitator. That's all I did in terms of how different these builds are, okay? And you can tell that I did a lot more damage, even with the pokes, which, like I said, low motion value, therefore elemental damage should deal even more damage. Even the pokes would deal more damage with a raw build than with an elemental build. And I think that's a little bit unreasonable. And I know that some of you guys are going to be like, well, Ruri, raw is just better, dude, and raw is cool. Why don't you like raw? Because my weapon deals over 1,000 more elemental damage. Like, what are even numbers at this point? Like, are you joking? Like, this weapon literally will, well, not the weapon, but the final build itself will literally just say, oh, you have like 1,000 plus something frost damage, whereas the raw weapon has like 690 raw. The elemental weapon would have like 640 something, plus 1,000 something elemental damage. And you're looking at it and you're just like, what are these numbers? What do these numbers even mean? And I already know that some of you guys are going to say, oh, well, Rurikhan, with elemental damage, you have to divide it by 10 and then you get the real number. Well, that's still 100 more damage. That would still put my weapon at like 750 or something in terms of damage. It's like 100 more damage than my raw damage weapon. Why does the raw damage weapon still beat it? On top of that, the elemental damage weapon also has critical element on this monster where you're supposed to use elemental damage. I understand that the way that the damage calculations are done and all of that stuff essentially, and the hit zones of the monsters, they essentially favor raw more. What I'm asking is why? And by the way, I'll have you know that I even skewed this in favor of the elemental damage weapon, because I didn't just put elemental damage. That particular set also has attack plus 7 on it. So if I was to remove the attack plus 7, the numbers you would look at would be a lot smaller than the numbers that you will see during the elemental damage attempt. Okay, so I even skewed things in favor of the elemental damage build by giving it raw damage build. If I was to remove that raw damage, that build would deal a lot less. And it's like, sure, the elemental damage gives you the openings whenever you break the elemental threshold, and it prevents you from dying, and yada, yada, yada. But it's like, this is clearly one of those fights where elemental damage should just flat out deal more damage. Just deal more damage. 1,000 elemental damage. And that's the other thing. Why do we need these bloated numbers? Can we get rid of the bloated numbers like forever? Like GU was so much better because you could actually see, oh, this weapon deals, 340, so I can directly compare it to another weapon and figure out whether or not they're on the same tier and figure out how much of a comparison they are and how adequate they are. Whereas in this game, it's like, oh, this gun lance deals like 500 damage, this hammer deals like 1,000 damage. Somehow it turns out that the gun lance is still way better than the hammer. It's like, bloated numbers make no sense to me, okay? So please, can we just get completely rid of this bloat, and can we just make elemental better? And I don't mean make elemental damage better by simply increasing the elemental damage numbers on the next set of weapons that you put in the game. I mean make elemental damage better by providing players better elemental hit zones, okay? Like, I don't know if that somehow breaks the game because then dual blades become too powerful, or what's the deal as to why we can't have proper elemental damage, but it's just so weird. And I feel like this situation with Alatreon is just something that we fell into because Capcom has kind of been like, oh, here's elemental damage, and we use it, and it's like, well, it's not that great, so we're not going to use it. And then it's like, no, you're going to use it because we're going to tell you to use it. Of course people are going to be like, but it sucks. Look, my numbers are smaller. But look, the second you put the damage numbers on the game, like, I kind of felt like this would eventually be a problem because people, they want to see the big damage numbers. That's just the way that it is. The previous Monster Hunter games didn't have damage numbers, so I don't think that this was as big of a deal. But in this one, because it has damage numbers, like, people will equip an elemental weapon, they'll see the number, they'll be like, it's smaller. It's smaller than before. It's supposed to be bigger, you know? So it's, I don't know. What do you guys think? Am I completely wrong here? Am I insane? Like, let me know. Maybe I am. Maybe hit the video with a dislike if you think that I'm completely off base here. Maybe I'll even end up deleting the video because, you know, I'm not too big on the whole math and damage calculations and all that stuff. This is just me looking at the system and being like, it doesn't make any sense that this monster that requires me to deal elemental damage will still take more damage from raw damage. Like, how does that work? Anyway, that's gonna be it for this video. If you enjoyed it, hit it with a like button. If you did not enjoy it, hit the dislike button. Feedback is important. Thank you all very much for watching. Stay strong, stay safe, peace out.